This is 7.6, Brain Notes number 2. The essential question is, what are the major portions of the brain and what are their functions? From the last notes, the diencephalon again is made up of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Thalamus is surrounded by the third ventricle. It's a relay center, so any information coming in from the spinal cord and the brainstem has to stop off at the thalamus, and they decide where the information will go in the cerebral cortex. It plays a major role in emotions and memory and awareness and cognition. Hypothalamus, remember, is slightly anterior and inferior diagonally from the thalamus, and it is the control and regulation of eating, drinking, appetite, water balance, and it controls the body temperature. It also regulates the consciousness, wakefulness, your emotions and behavior. Diurnal and circadian rhythm is your day and night cycle. That's what it tells you. In the daytime you are awake, at night you're asleep. And so if you have a job where you have to be awake at night and sleep during the day, then that's going to mess up your circadian rhythm. The hypothalamus plays an important role in the limbic system. Limbic system is a system in the brain where their job is to seek pleasure, eating, drinking, the needs, being able to sleep. Your behavior is driven by seeking things that make you feel good, and that's what limbic system is for. The pituitary gland, remember, hangs just inferiorly from the hypothalamus, slightly anterior, and that is a major endocrine gland that we will go over when we go over the endocrine system. Notice that the diencephalon is within the cerebrum. The name tells you. Di meaning two, there are two parts to it. Encephalon, cephalad meaning the head or the brain, and en meaning that it's inside it. It is made up of the thalamus superiorly, and then slightly diagonal, inferior and anterior to that is the hypothalamus, and then just below the hypothalamus you have the pituitary gland hanging down. Next is the brainstem. One thing to note, that brainstem in the human is inferior to the diencephalon and stands horizontally, whereas in the four-legged animal like the sheep, it is actually horizontal. The brainstem is a connection between the spinal cord and the diencephalon. The major parts are the midbrain, which contain the cerebral peduncle, which are the feet, the bottom portion of the midbrain. Then you have the corpora quadrigemina. Remember again that corpora quadrigemina is made up of the two superior colliculi and the two inferior colliculi, and together they make they help in. It's a reflex center for response to movement, depending on when you hear a sound or a visual stimuli and you're trying to quickly get out of the way or something. That is your corpora quadrigemina. Inferior to the midbrain is the pons, which connects the spinal cord with the brain and links basically the brain with all of the nerves coming in from the spinal cord up to the brain. And another function of the pons is control. It controls, helps in control of the breathing. The word pons literally means a bridge, so it is a bridge between the spinal cord and the brainstem and the rest of the brain. The most inferior portion is the medulla oblongata, and it is a regulatory center. They control many of the normal body functions, such as in cardiac center, which is controls your heart rate. A vasomotor center, which means it controls your blood vessel, whether they constrict or vasodilate. Respiratory center, it controls it's the main center for control of the not only the speed of breathing, but also how deep your breaths are. Pons aid in breathing, but medulla oblongata is the major part of controlling respiration. Other things that the medulla oblongata controls is swallowing, vomiting, coughing, sneezing, and hiccuping. So it is a major regulatory center. Reticular formation is a portion. Their job is for maintaining consciousness and wakefulness. And when you wake up in the after you sleep, it allows you to wake up. I guess the first thing you note is that the entire brainstem in the human, it is vertical, whereas in a four-legged animal, it is horizontal. The most superior brainstem is the midbrain. It is just inferior to the thalamus. And below that is the pons. And notice, compared to the sheep brain, that humans have a much larger pons than the medulla oblongata and the midbrain. Also note that because the brainstem is turned vertically rather than horizontally, the cerebral aqueduct and the fourth ventricle, which is right here, they are actually posterior to the brainstem, whereas in the sheep brain, they're actually below the cerebral aqueduct and the fourth ventricle. And the last portion of the brainstem is the medulla, which is the most inferior portion, which is connected to the spinal cord. And then a little section of the brainstem is your reticular formation. Another portion of the brain, remember that cerebellum means little brain, and they are two halves, just like there is cerebral hemisphere. There are two halves of the cerebellum. They're called cerebellar hemispheres, and Vermis is the connection between the two halves. And the word Vermis literally means worm, because that little middle section looks like a worm. The white matter tracts are called the arbor vitae. They look like little tree branches, and so that's where it gets its name. The cerebellar peduncle, remember, is just below the midbrain, but they are a connection between the cerebellum and other parts of the brain. Function of the cerebellum is for coordination and balance and posture. A damage to the cerebellum would mimic a situation where if you ever seen someone that is drunk, intoxicated, and how their body movement is, how they can't walk straight and they have a slurred speech, and that will be exactly what a person that had a cerebellum damage would act like. And in the picture, notice that the white area look like tree branches. That is your arbor vitae. And notice this little area here, just anterior to the cerebellum, is your fourth ventricle. Remember, in the sheep brain, it's actually inferior. And then in front of that is the pons. And remember this structure right here, that is your corpora quadrigemina. You can see the four parts to it, which is part of the midbrain. Protection covering, obviously the brain is protected by a layer of skin, which is covered with hair. And then underneath that skin, then you're going to have a layer of bone. And then below that, you're going to have 3 layers of connective tissues called the meninges. The outermost layer is called the Dura mater. The middle layer is called the Arachnoid mater. And then the most inner layer would be the pia mater. Again, meninges are the 3-layer covering of the brain and the spinal cord. And Dura mater is the most outer layer. And it is made up of dense, irregular connective tissue. And it is white, and it is very, very tough and hard to remove. It is attached to the periosteum, which is the covering of the bone. And any kind of infection in the cerebrospinal fluid or in the any kind of infection that will irritate the meninges is called the meningitis, and it could be dangerous. The middle layer is the arachnoid mater, and it gets its name from the spider web appearance that it has, and it connects the dura mater, anchors the dura mater to the brain, and it does not have any blood vessels. The space between the dura mater and the arachnoid mater is called the subdural space, and it is filled with fluid, and a lot of times if there is any damage to the brain and there's bleeding in the brain, it will basically pool or collect in the subdural space, which we call a subdural hematoma. The most inner layer and the layer that is actually attached to the brain itself is the pia mater, and it's that shiny layer at the top of the brain, and as soon as you touch it, it basically disappears because it is very thin. And it follows the contours of the brain, means that, remember that all the folds and the hills and the valleys of the brain, the pia mater follows the shape of the brain. The arachnoid mater and the dura mater does not do that. The space between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater is the subarachnoid space, and this is the space where the cerebrospinal fluid will flow and provide nutrients for the brain. Okay, the dura mater is the most outer layer. The arachnoid mater is the middle layer, and then the space between the dura mater and the arachnoid space is the subdural space. Sub meaning below, subdural means below the dura mater. And then the most inner layer is the pia mater, and then between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater is the subdural space, because subarachnoid means that it's below the arachnoid mater. Cerebrospinal fluid is the fluid that flows within the brain and the spinal cord, and their job is to protect, cushion, and nourish the brain and the spinal cord. And it is formed by the choroid plexus. Remember, inside the ventricle, the lateral ventricles, that dark material at the roof of the ventricle is the choroid plexus, and their job is to make cerebrospinal fluid. Also, ependymal cells form, remember what that is, one of the neuroglial cells, form a blood cerebrospinal fluid barrier, which is a protection between the blood and the brain, because anytime any kind of drugs or chemicals or toxins that are in the blood that can damage the brain, then the blood-brain barrier kind of separates them too, so they're not damaged. Recall that cerebrospinal fluid flows in the subarachnoid space, and the 4 ventricles, the 2 lateral ventricles and the 3rd ventricle and the 4th ventricle, and then it flows through the cerebral aqueduct, which is the connection between the 3rd and the 4th ventricle, and the color in the blue is where all of the flow of the cerebrospinal fluid. So it goes down all the way, it comes back up through the 4th ventricle, and so all of that flow of the cerebrospinal fluid keeps the brain protective from trauma. The brain is suspended in the fluid, so it's not hitting the side of the skull to cause damage, but also provides nutrients for the brain and the spinal cord. 7.6 notes homework. Number 1, what are the functions of the thalamus and the hypothalamus? Number 2, what are the major portions of the brainstem and what are their functions? Number 3, name the locations of the layers and spaces of the meninges.